but I'm sorry.
You're
Typically,
good.
by this time, it's supposed to be already live. Oh, we're live. Okay. So, hi, Casey. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Grace, thank you so much for having me today. How are you?
I'm good. You are such a legend because I remember when I started podcasting, you already podcast for like 3 years or something. And I was stalking, like, I saw some of the guests I just had, and then it was on your podcast, yeah, basically I would like research a guest, and then I constantly seeing, okay, Casey Adam had this person on or something. I was like, wow, this is like, I need to like be friends with this person one day. But fast forward to, recently, I feel like I've been just like such a big fan of your content. And
Yeah.
yeah, like I wanted to, yeah, like I told you last time, I feel like you had a major glow up moment happening from the hair to like the engagement and everything. You're killing it, obviously.
Thank you.
Um, to start with the show, I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit more. You, back in time, like 6 years ago, you had an injury. You were athletes, and you had an injury, and then you kind of started the entrepreneur journey early on. Why don't we start with maybe you telling the audience a little bit more about your journey into the podcasting and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I appreciate all the kind words, Grace, and thank you again for having me on the show today. Yeah, I mean, to dive into my story, it's one of those things, when having the time to reflect on it, it always seems, um, it brings me back to the quote of like, you can never connect the dots looking forward, only looking backwards. The famous quote by Steve Jobs. But my journey of all things podcasting and entrepreneurship started back in 2015, 2016. I grew up in a small town in Virginia. I grew up an athlete, two older brothers, played hockey growing up, played lacrosse, played football. And for me, what really came as a negative situation, which was this football injury, ended up being the biggest transformation in my life. So going into sophomore year of high school, I'm playing football. I end up getting injured, as I just mentioned, and this injury turned into something where I could never play football again in my life. I was in a neck brace for 6 months, and I really had to take a step back. And what I say is like find a new identity. And so over time, as I'm in my neck brace in my room as this 16-year-old kid, I'm spending a lot of time on my phone. I'm on social media, and I stumble across people like Tony Robbins and Gary Vee, and start learning about social media marketing, business, entrepreneurship. And it was really during that phase where I just went all in on, what that meant to me at the time, which was, hey, how can I go like make money online? How can I build a brand? How can I meet interesting people that I can learn from? And
Mhm.
that's where my podcast came into the picture, which for people that are watching, I've hosted my show, The Casey Adams Show, which is a entrepreneurship focused podcast for the last 6.5 years. And what started out as a show to connect with people in my bedroom in Virginia turned into hundreds of interviews with world-class founders and entrepreneurs, from Larry King to Maye Musk to the founders of Twitch and Netflix, to a
Mhm.
wide range of incredible people, including my lovely fiance, Jacqueline Burnett, who's an incredible author.
Hi,
And
Jacqueline.
I think
I
she
saw
was.
I saw her in the audience. Hi.
So, the interviews, and we'll dive into it, but just for the context as well, the podcast has for me been, I like to say, like the best foundation for a career as a 16, 17-year-old, with a lot of aspirations, because it's connected me with so many great people. I've been able to learn from them and really stay in touch and create business opportunities through these relationships. And that led to my last venture, MediaKits.com, which we'll get into, as well as my new venture, Listener.com, which
Mhm.
is a vertically integrated podcast network, which we'll, I'm sure, dive all into. But yeah, the podcast, and why I love the medium so much, is it's done so much for my life in terms of all the opportunities from a brand perspective, from a business perspective, and from a relationship perspective, which has trickled down into every aspect of life.
Oh, yeah, totally. I feel like one thing I really admire about you is like um I feel like you're carrying this like so naturally, and like you're not one of the hosts who would be like so aggressively like knocking down on like crazy stuff on the podcast, and then you make like the conversation so natural. I wanted to learn from you that like I feel like obviously you successfully turn your podcasting business into also like a software business in the past, and then now another software business. um like I would love to learn more about like what were some core lessons that you've learned from the guests that kind of helped you in your entrepreneurial journey? And the other one's like, I feel like, how do you kind of like maintain the relationship with the guests sometimes? Because, obviously you had like return guests like David Sachs or like some of the big entrepreneur in the Valley, like on the show. And I'm just like curious about learning about your journey on like, not only just building the relationship, but like also like maintaining it with the people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's no one strategy, and quite frankly, I don't even approach it where it's like I need to stay in touch with every guest, right? Like I think one of the biggest lessons I learned from Larry King, which is translated into all of my decisions in life, how I approach relationships, is he has this quote: "I've never learned anything while I was listening," and to simply be a listener. And I believe that over the years, and I've obviously gotten better at it over time, I try to approach every conversation with founders, yes, about their business and the founding story, but about who they are, what they do, the hardships they deal with. And like people always ask, like, "Oh, what's your show about?" And I've had musicians on, I've had athletes, I've had obviously mainly entrepreneurs and talking about business, but I love diving into the human story. And I believe, if you think about podcasting as a medium, like when you meet someone for the first time, how do you make a first impression? And in podcasting, typically I'm meeting with people that, are very successful. They've had, they meet so many people, but the ability to sit down with someone, ideally in person, which I do a lot now, and dive into their background, the hardships for 45 minutes to an hour, there's so much depth that you go into that I believe podcasting, I like to say, expedites relationships in terms of the ability to feel heard, the ability to go deep with someone. And, to the question of how do you stay in touch, I never think it's a goal like, how do I have this person on and stay in touch with them forever? Because naturally, you're obviously more gravitated to how can you help these people, right? Whether that's your at the time, whether that's what you're offering as a service perspective, or if it's just how can I, like, if I'm an expert at running and this person wants to get into the gym that was on a guest, like how can I just be valuable to them? And I think that's always the approach when I'm having people on, right? Like you brought up David Sachs, who I just had on the show again this past week. And I initially had on my podcast when he was running his business callin.com, which was a social podcasting app. And I ended up, after I had him on, I did about 30 to 40 different live shows on the platform. So it's like always thinking about like, hey, how can I bring value to this person, whether that's through trying their product, being a beta tester for their product, providing feedback, buying a product that, that they're selling, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, I think, in the grand scheme of business and life as a host, I value deeply relationships. I'm forgetting who exactly says it, but it's like no matter what business you're in the people business, right? You're talking to people, you're talking to customers, you're talking to your team. So value that and place a lot of importance on trying to build relationships. And again, that's been the thesis in my life since I was 17. And a book that really brought that point home was How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie. And I think that a lot of that book really was deeply ingrained into me when I was 17 years old, starting this journey of, hopefully meeting great people on the show.
For sure. I wonder, so, oh, by the way, can you hear like there's like a grass person outside of our house? Like I wanted to make sure that like we don't hear major noise. Do you hear major noise?
Not,
Okay, let me just shut it down just in case.
Perfect. No worries at all.
I'm so sorry. This is so unpredictable. I don't know when they come, but whenever I start podcasting, they are here. So
I've dealt with every issue and occurrence that you could ever imagine.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like you're such a just like genuine person on the like at least from like our interaction, and I wonder when it comes to like establishing like a business rapport with a guest. Like obviously you successful soda business in the past, like and then like some of the podcast guests or like just like audience or something like they all became your supporter on the business. And I wonder, how do you kind of like formulate the relationship towards like the business side? Obviously, it can be like, you like, I feel like you've done it like so organically and authentically. And I'm just curious, like, how do you kind of like transition from like, a person who is like interacting with them on like a more surface level to like a business relationship?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think there's, what I say here, there's no one size fits all, but I believe that even in the context of, the world of the creator economy, I believe a lot of, what stems to business behavior is how you show up, your self-confidence and the belief in what you're doing. Meaning, even prior to starting a podcast, I was this 16-year-old kid putting out content on social media. And, people would always say, or people would ask me questions back then of like, do you feel that people don't take you as seriously since you're young? And the answer was never like, yeah, I don't feel like I don't take, I feel like I don't get taken seriously. It's no, it's like I take myself seriously. And most of the time, like that translates. And that's, how you show up in the
Mhm.
world, how you show up in relationships, how you show up with an intense amount of curiosity, knowing that like, hey, I'm here to learn. But, and I think again, from the context of how do you go from, and the reference that I believe you've heard before, which I always love saying, which is great for context, is I've done 400 plus interviews on my podcast, and my last company, MediaKits, we raised a round of funding from 37 angel investors, and about 80 to 90% of those investors were past guests on my podcast. And looking back, was that the plan? Was it to have people on the show to create business opportunity? Not necessarily, but it's the timing aspect, right? Of I'm starting a company that was a software business in the creator economy, MediaKits.com, which it was
Mhm.
the easiest way for creators to aggregate their cross-platform social data into one place. And of course, through my interest and curiosity over the years, I've interviewed lots of investors. I've interviewed lots of people working in the creator economy. I've interviewed people that have built massive media businesses that, regardless if they wanted to invest, I wanted their feedback. And of course, they would want to give it to me because we've been in touch and I've never asked them for
Mhm.
anything. It's like, hey, I'm starting this new business. Like, would love to get, a couple minutes of your time to, hey, like tell you what we're doing, but also get some feedback. And I think that was always the approach in the earliest phases of like getting validation from people you trust. And of course, when you're kicking off a fundraise, you want to bring in great people. You want to have people that believe in you. And it wasn't that, I didn't just talk to the past guests on my podcast, but when you think about warm intros or having people that you have a relationship with, like those are the people that I've had lots of conversations with. We've gotten to know each other. I've talked to their teams. I've talked to their assistants, and the ability to go out and have conversations with them about what you're building, I think is a natural was a natural gateway for me. And it doesn't have to be podcasting, right? Like some people, if you just think about what you're doing, like, hey, how can I build a great foundation of meeting people? Some people, like I've done in the past, I used to host a lot of events for a media company I ran.
Mhm.
And, if people are hosting events, you're always bringing people together, you're meeting people, you're sort of the source of connection. And therefore,
Mhm.
people, they know you, they like you, they trust you because you're bringing great people together, hopefully in a good environment. So, again, I know we're speaking a lot about podcasting here, but I think taking a step back and recognizing like, hey, how do you build quality relationships? You're bringing value to someone, you have shared interest. And for me, by having a show, providing a platform for someone to speak on, like that is
Mhm.
at first a hopeful step of value that people can gravitate towards to then open up a more, like a deep relationship, and not to say like convert them from a guest to a business relationship, but those people you have rapport with, and those are the people that, would more likely are going to take your call than people just cold emailing, cold DMing you, even though that's a great approach as well. But you want to go after people that know you, and that's what we did in the early days of Media Kits.
I wonder, I wanna say hi to the LinkedIn user. Hi, LinkedIn user, I can't see your name, but hi. So I wanted to learn more about, like, okay, so I feel like you are so good at, like, I'm sure, like, one of the major things I have to ask for the audience is, like, how do you get guests? Like, literally, this is, like, the most, like, asked question, I feel like when I first started my show, people were like, "How do you get XYZ?" And all that kind of things. I wonder when you first started. I mean, I'm sure at this point you already kind of know everyone. You're like you're like entrepreneur yourself, so like you already kind of like build up the network. But prior to the era that you had the warm connection to people, like how do you kind of like breaking into the scene?
Yeah, it's so funny. I've never used this reference before, but it just popped in my head. And because I know someone said, I take myself seriously. Someone asked me if I was bold.
Uh,
Our responses that don't discredit my experience. Yeah, I mean, I think one is like taking yourself seriously. Where how do I get guests? It's always been like, how do you, if you go to Starbucks, how do you get a drink, right? You ask, you ask for it, right? You look at the menu and you say, I want this. And in the early days of podcasting, I have zero relationships, zero business connections. I can't, my family is not entrepreneurial, so I can't go to like people close to me and say, hey, like I want to talk about business on a show. And at the time, this was 2017, 2018 when I had, when I was first starting the show, it was all about cold DM. And matter of fact, still to this day, most of the guests that I've ever had on the show have come from a cold DM on Instagram, sometimes Twitter, now X, sometimes LinkedIn, but rarely, even though I try. And over the years, it's shifted a lot, right? It's kind of like the analogy of you start pushing up a boulder, you start pushing a boulder up a hill, and it's very hard in the early phases, but then over time, people might be pulling from the top and it gets easier, meaning with like anything, with momentum, nowadays it's a lot, I don't want to call it easier, but having the backlog of content and interviews you can use as references of getting people on. And, a story that I like to tell, which is sort of like my blueprint to putting a guest in a position to say yes, like make it the easiest yes in the world. And it's a blueprint that is very simple. And it's something you can approach in every aspect of life and business, which is one of my interviews that I was like over the moon about was the rapper Rick Ross, right? And he's someone that I obviously listened to growing up, but he has this massive audience. He was coming out with a book. I'm like, oh, it'd be so cool to have Rick Ross on the show. And my framework is I know based on me following Rick Ross, I have a natural, like, I understand his life, I understand his brand, I understand things about him. And I knew that he was a huge fan of the author, Robert Greene, the author of the 48 Laws of Power. And at the time, I just had Robert on my show. I'm a huge Robert Greene fan myself. And my message when I reached out, like a cold DM to Rick Ross on Instagram was, hey, it was very short and simple. It was like, hey, it would be an absolute pleasure to have you on my show, my podcast. I recently had Robert Greene on the show. And I'd love to have you on to talk about your book, your new book. All we need is 20 minutes. Let me know if you'd be interested. And, that's kind of butchered how it was, but that was the overall thesis of, hey, I just had Robert Greene on the show, would love to promote your book. And all we need is 20 to 25 minutes. So it was establishing rapport of referencing someone that I know he likes and me actually having the research and the context of knowing that. So there's trust there. Like, oh, yeah, him and Robert are friends. So it's like, oh, my guy Robert was on his show. Great. And then it was, hey, knowing that you have a book coming out and it's important to you that you want to talk about this book, you're promoting it on social at the time. It's all you're talking about. And then lastly, the time element I think is super important. Granted, 20 to 25 minutes is not the typical length of my show, but at the time it's, whether it's 15 minutes or 30 minutes, just getting your foot in the door and having people say yes, it's a much more easy thing to say yes to. And it's funny because there's a clip that maybe I'll find later and I'll send it to you, is on the show with Rick Ross, which I never ask. I asked him, like, why did you end up doing this podcast? Like, why did you say yes to this? Like, you don't do a lot of podcasts. And I'm this young 18-year-old kid. And he goes, man, and he says it in his Rick Ross voice. He's like, man, you presented yourself like a boss. You didn't come with your hand out. You came to me. My guy, Robert, you came with a specific time frame. My time's valuable. And that's it. And, he says it in the context of just value to him. And I think that's what people recognize with having a podcast. Of course, there's like a time frame where, going on Joe Rogan, it's like, oh my God, that is doing you the biggest service to go on there. Like everyone would want to go on that show. But when you're building a show from the ground up, and like I was, and still am day to day, you need to think about what's in it for the guest and how can you serve the guest. And that goes with podcasting, but it also goes with business overall. How can you serve your customer? How can you serve your audience as a creator? And I think that's a question that we should all ask ourselves is, how can I best serve blank? A future host or a future guest, a future customer, a future business partner. And if you do that, I think the script will flip of like, how can I go get guests on, to then how can I create an environment that guests want to be on this show? And it comes from doing your research and having the context of knowing and liking what they do. It comes from referencing things that they like or things that, that would have them say, wow, like they did their research into me. And then lastly is just presenting it in a way that, hopefully they see it as valuable, of course. But again, that goes with saying, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I probably reached out to Rick Ross 15 times, unsent the message back and forth so that he wouldn't think I'm spamming him. And you just got to keep shooting your shot, right? Like, I was
Mhm.
never afraid to ask. And
Mhm.
when it comes to having people on the show, and then again, and I'll pause here. It was very challenging at first, but then once you start building momentum, and that doesn't need to be big names. That just means I know that at interview 13, I was terrible in terms of my choppiness, the way I speak, the way I ask questions, the way I carry the conversation. So getting your reps in is the most important part. And if I tell anyone this, you shouldn't necessarily go after all the big names or big
Mhm.
people that you want to have on at the beginning, because you want to be a better host, a better interviewer, a better whatever it may be, when you're having these people on. So focus on the reps, I think, is what's most important, and the rest will take care of itself.
I agree 100% because I feel like, I also can see your confidence and like, you're like carrying the conversation so naturally. And then you also like, I feel like, as I mentioned, as a glow up, I don't mean just like your appearance change or something or fashion sense. It's more of like how you carry yourself. And like, I mean, by being a viewer like 3 years ago to like now, I feel like you've just like had major like glow up in your performance, or like by performance,
That's
I don't mean like a theater performance. Is more of like a performance as a like athlete, or a performance as a like a professional in the business. And like I feel like I've just seen like you transform yourself, and I'm like trying to transform myself as like I feel like it's a really good way to kind of also podcast is a great way to like like kind of like program your mind because you're actively listening and like learning from people. And I just like feel like I can see the drastic difference like by putting the reps in.
Thank you. It's so funny. Even like, and I don't know if Jacqueline's still here watching live, but my fiance, a lot of credit goes to her. She's like, "Hey, grow your hair out," right? Like, whether that's appearance, how you show up, how you dress, like all the things that over the years I've not only focused on, but kind of ask yourself, how do you show up in the world? And like we've been together for 4 years. We got engaged last year, and a lot of credit to
Congratulations.
her to thank you to yeah, just helping me in areas where I necessarily didn't focus myself. Right, it takes a team in a relationship, in a business. Having people in your life that can help you improve, that can see things from a perspective that you may not, is always valuable. So appreciate the kind words there.
I wonder, let's talk about your businesses, right? Like, why don't we start with like you want to start with your current business first, or you want to start with like Media Kit first? I think both of them are very interesting. I'll leave the decision to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think having a listener just from the contextual standpoint in this conversation thus far would be great. Um, and really, just to give you context and the viewers, listener.com is a company that I launched about 6 months ago.
Mhm,
And how I best describe it is a vertically integrated podcast network where we really focus on three main components, which is podcast related services, which is helping CEOs and corporate leaders get booked on top business podcasts to tell their story, to amplify their content, and to really connect with that depth of listener. And then we also have our own software side of the business, which is a tool called Listener FM, which is this AI post production tool for podcasters where they can upload video and audio and create these SEO optimized titles, descriptions, show notes, blog posts, which has been awesome. It's something that we use internally, and we have a customer base there. And then lastly, which kind of goes into what we're talking about so far today, which is the actual podcast network and the media side of what we do, where,
mhm,
right now, my show, The Casey Adams Show, is a part of the listener.com podcast network. We
mhm,
have one other show that we're slowly but surely getting off the ground, called Questions, which is
mhm,
hosted by myself, my good friend DJ Swivel, who's this Grammy winning music producer, and Brandon Jenner. And outside of the shows that we have in the network, I like to say we're creating one of the first podcasting media companies, in the sense of
mhm,
we just launched a newsletter that is all about podcasting about 5-6 weeks ago. And it's really about bridging the gap between the business of podcasting, meaning acquisitions in the space, the investments happening in the space, tied to the more culturally relevant moments of, hey, like Cristiano Ronaldo going on the Whoop podcast, to LeBron James starting his own uninterrupted podcast network, and bridging those two worlds to sort of be what Barstool was to the sports media. We want listener.com to be for podcasting media. And we are just strong believers in what that means. And it's this, in my opinion, this white space of potential, because podcasting is so integrated into our culture now. When it comes to whether that's celebrities going on shows, to it being so ingrained in terms of like the press and what you see and the clips on social media in a sense. So that's listener. Of course, there's a lot of things to dive into there, and even just to backtrack a little bit to cover what you said about MediaKits. Starting this company, Listener, is coming off of the background of my last venture, MediaKits, which was acquired by a company, Viral Nation, and back in 2022. And after that experience and that outcome, it was taking time to say, hey, like, what do I want to go build next? And podcasting has always been, as we've talked about today, such an important part of my life. I started it 6.5 years ago on the show. Even through running MediaKits, I was hosting my show, and we were working with lots of creators and podcasters in terms of, them being signed up for our tool. But podcast has always come full circle to me. So it's really understanding the opportunity and now going to build a business, even like acquiring a domain that I believe is very like representative of what I want the brand to mean, listener.com. It goes back to the roots of podcasting, how I believe in the industry, how I believe in, what it is to business owners, to creators, et cetera. So a lot to dive into there, but that's Listener, and obviously happy to dive into MediaKits as well.
Dude, I feel like this is such a underserved space. I completely agree with you, because from like our chat last time, like you mentioned about like, everyone's gonna have a podcast by, I don't know, 2025 or something. So like I totally believe in the space as well, but I'm just out of curiosity on like, how do you see it like monetize, as obviously you're providing a SaaS software, and then you're creating a show, or you're creating a network for people to be on. In Silicon Valley we had like that kind of opportunity as well. So like there's some people creating like, let's call it like SaaS podcast network. So like basically all the SaaS leader are going to the SaaS podcast.
Yeah.
Or like just like basically that's like the major idea of like this whole like network thing. It's like you can sell high ticket item to like a corporation, or like basically companies have budget to marketing their leaders or like marketing people to like use their software. So that's like a business opportunity for like a domain kind of people. How do you see the broader business spectrum? Because I feel like I live in a Silicon Valley bubble. I'm not gonna like pretend it's not. I feel like it's like we're like, I think your show is a lot more diverse, since like you're based in LA, and like you have like celebrities, or like your like co-founders are kind of like celebrities or like domain experts in like other field that's not like SaaS or like
Sure.
I wanted to learn more about like, you mentioned like the culture reference and everything. Like please give us like some information about like how the universe is working outside of Silicon Valley, because I feel like a lot of my listeners are like literally living like outside of New York tech scene. So like I would love to learn more about like the from like a general like culture ecosystem. Like how do you think podcast is going to play in like the next 10 years? And then how do you visualize your business become like, obviously you mentioned about like Barstool for podcasters. What does that mean? So sorry.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
So, like broad about
Yeah.
it.
No, I love it. And I even think too, like even for like context, I recently spoke at an event here in Los Angeles called Podcast Movement, and my whole keynote or this session was about, it was titled Voice to Venture, like how to build a brand and a story through podcasting that translates to business. And, we talked about the monetizations aspect of it. And I think, we went through this phase in terms of like the podcasting business. Like there's a lot of people that talk about, in 2020, 2021, same with creator economy. Like there was this massive boom of investment dollars, Spotify making all these acquisitions in the space, other brands making lots of acquisitions, where so much money was poured into this space regarding tech, regarding content acquisitions, et cetera, where obviously, and you read some of the articles, and overall the industry has continued to grow, but in terms of the investment approach from things like Spotify, we've kind of seen how that's played out in terms of Spotify being the biggest listener platform, to shows being exclusive, and then Joe Rogan being not exclusive but still exclusive. Like, all of these things that people wanted to see with the space have played out, where I talked to a lot of executives at different podcasting companies, and when you think about the future of it, and again, these are all my opinions, no one can predict the future, of course, but it's an industry that is propped up in this lens of maturity, where 6 years ago when I came out with my show, like, I put out an episode with like really no marketing engine, and I was like top 200 podcasts in the world, and like the charts were like, whoa, like, what's it? There was no Spotify. It was a different era of like, anyone with a mic with terrible audio could put out something and it could do well, or you could just kind of, yeah, it felt less mature. Where nowadays, again, like, you have massive celebrities launching shows, all the podcast networks are like, you have like these great world-class studios that are producing shows that are top tier quality. You have all the big news networks launching shows. Sports media is massive in terms of sports podcasts, etc. Where, yeah, again, I think from the maturity aspect, listener.com is at this, if there was a wave of investment dollars and like kind of building that maturity, we're sitting at the ground floor of a now more mature industry when it comes to advertising capabilities, with the growing ad revenue in the space, with the maturity of show quality and show expectations of like, hey, I used to say, I started my podcast on a pair of Apple headphones, and I was walking around my bedroom saying, welcome to the show. And not that I used to say quality doesn't matter, but it was about, get it out there. Like, just don't even focus on the quality. Like, my first 50 episodes were not even like video. So, but nowadays the script has flipped, meaning I believe people should focus strongly on quality. Obviously, quality audio is like the baseline of expectation. The quality video and video podcasting is obviously extremely important in terms of the clips on social media, in terms of building an audience. So again, I think there's these natural shifts that happen to podcasting that's tied to social media trends, tied to creator economy and how that's exploded. Where you have people like Colin and Samir sitting down with the CEO of YouTube, and like, that is such a better channel for that conversation to happen than reading an article about what the CEO of YouTube thinks about the creator economy, right? So again, there's so many directions of like, what does the industry look like? What does listener look like? But for us, coming from the background of having a show, having built a company in the creator space in tech, I approach listener from the lens of, again, when I say vertically integrated podcast network, the service element is something that we are not only extremely focused on, but it's really our bread and butter in terms of helping corporate leaders and entrepreneurs get booked on shows. Because it's been such a natural business for me as someone that's had a show and that interviews people, and creating an incredible system there. But on the more, as you said, the Barstool sports media, podcasting media front, again, like, this is something that, there's a lot of great brands out there that I love that create content in podcasting. One of them being Sounds Profitable. They have an incredible team over there. And I believe that the media of showcasing what's happening in the world of podcasting is lacking. And as someone that's extremely passionate and lives in it, it's a vertical. Again, when you think about sports media, I think there's a similar lens of podcast media that need and should be created that we're extremely focused on. And on our Instagram page at Listener, we're creating a lot of content around like a social first approach to our newsletter, but also podcasting media. Again, it's very early innings, right? We're 6 months into building Listener. Our focus is on the service front. And we're taking it step by step, right? Like, this is a business where I haven't went out and raised capital. It's a very step-by-step initial approach to what we're doing. And a lot of exciting things are happening, from the shows, from the interest, from the clients, from the companies we're working with, to the newsletter that we launched, which obviously we can dive more into. if interested. But yeah,
Mhm.
I'll pause there because I think, from the conversation of the podcast industry, how we see it as listener, how you see it as creator, I think the
Mhm.
overall thesis is the medium has matured so much. More money, ad revenue is continue to be poured into it. A lot of even founders I interview, I will ask them how podcasting has influenced your business. And
Mhm.
like a conversation that this one isn't out yet, but I'll kind of touch on it.
Mhm.
Uh, my conversation with the CEO of Momentous, which is a high performance supplement company. They have an incredible partnership with Andrew Huberman from Huberman Lab. And we
Mhm.
were talking on the show about how impactful that was for their business. And, when the show comes out, people can listen to what he has to say. But it's incredible. Like if you do podcasting right in terms of how you
Mhm.
integrate it into your business, how you work with podcasters that have a real audience, it's a medium that is still um, being discovered. And I think
Mhm.
there's so much opportunity, and that's hence why we're spending all of our time and effort
Mhm.
building listener.com, because there's so many things that are exciting, and what's happening in the space is just really cool to see and be a part of.
I have so many questions there. Like, I completely agree with what you said about like there is like podcasts can make like a major influence in business owner or like just like founders life in general. I wonder like in terms of like the monetization piece, obviously like you guys have a network and like you have like brands that you work with. I wonder number one is like how do you like filter out like what brands could benefit a lot from it? And then the other part is like I don't know what's your experience, but, like, I feel like from, like, the monetization piece, a lot of it are leaning towards, like, people that are already listeners and, like, when they outreach to you, like, they are, like, better convert as, like, a client versus, like, you go outbound. I wonder what is, like, your experience on, like, either, like, outbound f to get a client or like inbounding like client relationship, like how does like the monetization piece kind of like come together in your experience?
Yeah. So, again, the main service side of what we do, like helping founders get
Mhm.
booked on shows, a
Mhm.
lot of it is inbound for sure. Like I have
Mhm.
guests on my show. People are
Mhm.
always recommending me guests. People are saying, "How can I go be on other shows?" And after that happened for so long, you start to say, like, "Hey,
Yeah.
how can I help people with this?" And not to say we don't do outbound, but like in this early phase of it, it's simply like, what is our um, threshold of to do something great with a certain amount of clients, and a
Mhm.
lot of that has come from inbound and referrals, and even too on just like the overall podcast monetization front. I
Mhm.
believe, again, podcasting is a vehicle that you can choose to monetize or bring value to in many different ways. Where, over the years of hosting my shows, I've worked with a handful of brands, but when I do, and this is even what my keynote was about at
Mhm.
Podcast Movement, which was voice to venture, right? How do you um, create a story and a brand podcasting that lasts and convert that to a business opportunities? And for me, back in 2022, I believe, I did a deal with Slack where
Mhm.
we did some podcast, stuff, advertising, brand deals, but we also did a very unique, um, like a unique campaign, which is really prevalent to even what we're doing today, which is this LinkedIn Live, which their team was incredible in terms of orchestrating and putting together, which
Mhm.
was I ended up hosting as a host this panel live on
Mhm.
LinkedIn on the Slack LinkedIn page.
Mhm.
And it was Small Business Saturday, where host of the Casey Adams Show and founder of
Mhm.
MediaKits.com at the time, was hosting four other business owners, like I do on my show, talking about their business, talking about challenges, talking about all the things that were on the agenda. And in terms of monetizing from the show perspective and just as a podcaster, instead of just working with a brand, them doing
Mhm.
ad slots or doing host read ads, the ability to get creative of your approach of how do you leverage your experience as a host and
Mhm.
how you bring that skill set to the table. This was a great opportunity and more of an example that I believe just allows me to even think back of like, how can I do more creative things like that with brands we work with?
Mhm.
And again, we hosted this panel live on LinkedIn for the people, me as a host, my podcasting presence and skill set. Then we also did some short form content, of course, and of course, did some like stuff directly on the podcast.
Mhm.
So I say that because I think in the world of podcasting, a lot of people stepping into it are saying, how do I start a show? And then obviously it's challenging and it's a lot of work. So how can I
Mhm.
monetize it so it makes sense? And typically people lean into, advertising, and then now more than ever, paid community, which I think are obviously
Mhm.
still two incredible growing verticals. But for me, if I never worked with a brand on my show, the value as a business owner and as someone that's building a brand and is loves the medium of podcasting,
Mhm.
like I'm gonna do this forever. And the goal is obviously
Mhm.
continue growing and work with incredible brands as we have before. But for me, again, the context and the story of how the podcast guests have converted into, for my last venture, investors, advisors, and just people in my corner. I can't tell you like the amount of immense value it has brought to me that could be even intangible
Mhm.
through podcasting. So I think it's understanding like you can start a show and make the goal of like how is this valuable in terms of like just strictly monetization. But that's when you see, people get burnt out of, the average show puts out 10
Mhm.
episodes and then never puts out another one.
Mhm.
It's because it's a hard medium in terms of there's a lot of heavy lifting. Granted, with tools
Mhm.
nowadays, it's gotten easier and easier in terms of content and recording and short form editing, etc. But again, like from the listener front, a lot of what we do is very ecosystem driven. So the more I'm interviewing great people leads to
Mhm.
potential working with them from a client perspective, helping them even launch their own shows, leads them to being a part of our newsletter and the media efforts we're doing. And of course, leads to if they have a show themselves, which a lot of founders do nowadays, they can even use our tools that we've built internally from the SaaS perspective. So again, even like to bring it back to the top of like what I say vertically integrated podcast network, I'm such a strong believer in just the ecosystem of what we're doing. And again, I don't like to say all that as in we're trying to do so many
Mhm.
things, but it all is very synergistic to what I've been doing for 6 years. And now what the company has been focused on the last 6 months.
Mm. I wonder, let's talk about like, for example, you mentioned like the Slack deal and like I wonder for these like major brands, would that approach be like maybe you outreach to propose a plan in the first place? Or would it be like, someone from the team already reach out to you and then you kind of like negotiate into a plan? I wonder how do you kind of like formulate the business aspect of things in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think with any, you know, business encounter, did it come to you or did you go to them, right? Are you pitching them or are they pitching you, first of all? And one thing that I'll say about podcasting, which I think is a hidden gem that a lot of podcasters may not recognize from the brand, from working with brands, but also getting great guests. And
Mhm.
I haven't heard someone say it as I'm about to say it. And I think if I heard this years ago, I would say, whoa, I need to do that, which is I'll start from the guest perspective. Over the last probably 6 months, I've worked with some incredible PR companies that
Mhm.
represent brands, represent founders, that it's their sole job to help them get booked in articles and just create opportunities for them, like as a PR company.
Mhm.
And having relationships with these PR companies, they've sent me some incredible guests to have on my
Mhm.
show in batches, like great
Mhm.
people that I would
Mhm.
love to have on that I might have had to reach out 10 different ways to have 10 different people on the show versus working with a PR company, or being, just in contact with one that's like, hey, these are our clients. Would love to see if you'd be interested in having them on the show. That's happened so much more recently. And I think it's something where if you're having a show, like reach out to companies that represent clients because that can be that one to many model of doing them a favor and having them, send you great guests. But on the brand side as well, meaning, with Slack, they have an agency that's doing a lot of their and I don't again, I don't want to speak on what they do or don't do or what they
Mhm. Yeah, 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 totally.
be doing. I have no
Mhm.
idea. But when I was working with them, they were working with a great team that was orchestrating a lot of these podcaster relationships, content creator influencer partnerships. So, it wasn't like I'm cold DMing the CMO of Slack on LinkedIn, or they didn't like reach out directly in terms of Slack. It was an agency they're working with or some type of company that's working with brands to help activate podcasting strategy, et cetera.
Mhm.
And I think again, like those are two pieces of, I don't want to call it advice, but just realizations that I've had over the years of companies or PR companies or ad agencies that you can reach out to, that they can reach out to you because they work with these big clients. That can be a great step and foot in the door. Because again, if this is a company that works with Slack and five other brands, like, that can be five other opportunities for you as a host that you can explore through one conversation instead of trying to go, pitch five different brands in a
Mhm.
sense. But again, over the years, a lot of stuff has come inbound and vice versa. A lot, sometimes it's cold outreach. I love a brand, I love a product. I
Mhm.
reach out to have the founder on the show, and then we do a deal where they're partners on the show or now partnered with Listener of the newsletter because of just like wanting to work with them and the natural brand fit. Um, and I think that's important as a podcaster, right? Like someone that I think does it very well. Chris Williamson has just done a great job the last handful of years that I've been following his content, but also in the brand sense of partnering with brands that align with his show, that align with his audience. And yeah, I think there's obviously so much to dive into in terms of the
Mhm.
monetization aspect, but there is no one size fits all, right? Like the blueprint that I'm laying out in terms of how guests have turned to investors. Like there was no blueprint of like, oh, I've seen someone do this before. Let me try that. It's great. Like if you want to have a show, commit to it to the long term.
Mhm.
Podcasting is something where you could have the biggest celebrities on for 10 episodes. But then if you don't put out an 11th episode, your show's not going to matter because it's about the consistent. I don't want to say it's not going to matter, but it's about the consistency of the show, the long term of how you approach it. And I think that's different than social media, right? Like nowadays, you can create a new TikTok or Instagram account, throw up 10 TikToks, and one could get 1.2 million views because it's, the algorithm, which with podcasting, it is a slow approach to building reputation, building quality audience, getting quality guests, or if not guests, quality information. And it's you're only as good as your last at bat, right? Like you got to keep hopefully getting more great guests on and
Mhm.
having great production. And that's something that I don't think people should overlook, of like, hey, like really commit to something for the long term with podcasting and reinvent yourself, reinvent whether that's the cover, whether if you need to
Mhm.
change the title. Like my show when starting was called Rise of the Young because I wanted to
Mhm.
bring
Oh, yeah, I
entrepreneurs.
totally remember that era. And then I think at one point you had, like, Tom Ward on your show, and then after that I saw it's Casey Adams show. I think that before that it was, like, The Rise of Young.
Yeah, I think it's like, as humans too, we all have like our identity is tied up in what we do, where we spend
Yeah,
time, how we grew up. And Rise of the Young was the podcast name
the
that
first era of the
yeah.
Casey Adams show, yeah.
And then I switched to the Casey Adams show because it felt right. It felt more long term. It felt personal brand focused, and it's again, like I'm so glad I did. But yeah, I'm not just be open to change. Right, that's the biggest thing
Mhm.
with podcasting is always try to get better every episode as a host, whether from the production quality, etc. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
you'll see tomorrow I'll change this to the Grace Cone show.
yeah, it's getting advice and feedback from people, but also like making sure that it's something that you feel great about, I think is what it comes down to.
I have I have some questions there. I feel like definitely agree with you on like the PR companies. I've been like very fortunately like getting some like outreach from the PR company. They've sent some like amazing people that I feel like I wouldn't even thought of like myself, and like they're just amazing. And I wonder in terms of like the so I feel like one of the challenge of like being a podcaster in a niche industry is like the download number is never going to be Joe Rogan. Like we're not talking about like things that are like, in the venture capital ecosystem, like, or like in the startup ecosystem, like, or especially in the SaaS, like, because a lot of our guests are like SaaS investors, AI investors. They're like, I guess like call it like 30K people in the world that are actually paying attention to this niche. And then, you can only capture so much of the market as like we're not the Joe Rogan show. We're not promoting, the athletic greens of the world. Like, so it's like a niche industry. How do you translate like the value that you're providing to like the people who are actually maybe like the right clients for you? Because like typically, let's call it like the PR company will be like, okay, so what's your download number? And like, if you're if you're like, trying to work with like the better help of the world, like the CPM is like a very important, like, maybe they will pay you like, I don't know, $10 per 1,000 click, like, but like your entire TAM is like 10K people. So
Yeah, yeah.
like how do you kind of translate the value of your listeners or like your download number into like what actually convert? So like, or just in general, like how do you kind of like sell a niche product as a podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me that I spoke about at this event too is, in the world of CPM and brands paying per thousand downloads, et cetera, I've always tried to do the opposite, quite frankly, meaning, why do people pay $7 for a Starbucks coffee and, you know, $3 for another? It could be the same coffee. It could be the same downloads. It's brand. And I think the biggest thing with podcasting is it's how you show up and how you also, you know, how you want to work with a brand. Of course, numbers are important, data is important. I'm not discounting that. Like my last company was a data and analytics company
Mhm,
for creators to do brand deals and to showcase data.
mhm, mm,
But you could look at three different media kits in this example where they could have the same exact data, right? Same exact data, engagement rate, comments, average like count in terms of followers,
mhm,
but you take away the person, you take away the brand, you take away, what they mean to their community, how they show up in the world, and you could have dramatically different rates, right? And that's the biggest thing with podcasting specifically. I think you need to treat it as just another aspect of your brand, right? When people work with my show, yes, they're working with the Casey Adams show, but no, they're working with Casey Adams, the brand, the entrepreneur, the business owner, and that is a vertical of what I do. And that's when I like this word vertical integration with my the listener.com. I think about the same way for my podcast, where it's like, how do you do these vertically integrated deals with companies where yes, they're working with your podcast, but they're also working with you on social media campaigns, stories, reels, and also to add that third vertical of what we talked about, the LinkedIn live stream with Slack. Excuse me. Like really leaning into what's more than just the numbers. They can work with so many people. There's millions of podcasts. Why you? What stands out? What's different? What's unique? And how do you position yourself to, I don't want to say demand more, but to build your brand where brands want to work with you for you, not because you have, similar data to X amount of podcasters, right? And I think
mhm.
that's what um, is more and more important, especially in this world of AI, right? Where I've been seeing, which is really cool, of like brands launching AI podcasts.
Oh God.
They have like AI voices launching shows to talk about an industry, and it's
Oh
like,
God, no, please
but
don't. I mean, that's
but
crazy.
again, like the human, back to the quote or like the reference earlier, it's like you're always going to be in the people business, right? So it's like working with a specific host, a specific individual, a specific brand, like what makes that unique. Um, and I think that's just a great question to ask yourself where, yeah, you can establish value, you can package value that's way more than just, hey, you know, we're paying X per download, which again, you can lean into that. And I'm not saying I haven't done that in the past, but really just take the bigger approach of like, what are the bigger opportunities? How can you do long-term partnerships with brands? Or, lead into client work? Because I think it's just really understanding like what's the long tail of, who they're working with versus just like the data itself.
Mm. I wonder in terms of like marketing for your show, like I feel like you've done such a great job on social, like especially Instagram, like, and I feel like I've seen your growth that like happening so fast. And like I wonder what's your thought on like, promoting and marketing your show? How do you think about like each kind of like platform as like your like under the Casey Adam brand, like where would you focus more on, and like what's your growth strategy on, let's call it like an Instagram or like other visual related like platforms or like Twitter or like anything that's like beyond the podcasting platform itself?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I don't have it all figured out, and we're trying to get better every day, and I love to be upfront about that. But I think for me over the years, like Instagram has always been my main like lever that I pull where I feel closest to my community or people that listen to the show. Obviously, in this world of short form content, our whole simple approach, even for the sake of time, is, long form. We have our long form podcast. We like to create 5 to 8 pieces of, or 3 to 5, sometimes more pieces of short form content to post on Instagram, TikTok, Reels. LinkedIn has become a lot more important as well, that trying to really lean into this year. But I think at the end of the day, the simplistic answer is no one's going to listen to your show unless you put it out there and you create engaging styles of trailers. Like a person that I'll reference that is doing it so great is Stephen Bartlett, in terms of the
So
team
true. Oh
that
my God. The first minute of his episodes are so wildly cut it. I'm
yeah.
like, wow, it's like a
And
tiny trailer of this thing. It's
And
like
I
so
think you gotta give credit where credit is due, where I see his team and what they're doing, and they are just incredible, from the engagement to the growth to the strategy. And I think we could all learn from their playbook versus trying, me today to tell you our internal playbook. Like we're doing things that, yes, represent long form to short form at scale cross platform, but then there's the true science to it. Like, how are you split testing? How are you creating the most engaging trailers? Like, what's the growth strategy? How, what's the team look like? And again, I think if we all get something from this, go look at Stephen Bartlett and what they're doing and understand, just watch what they do and how they're doing it. And I think we could just, all learn from that as people that are looking to build great shows.
dude, but I feel like even just like the first minute of the show is probably gonna cost like $1 million or something, because they're so wildly cut it, and then they can find like the historical footage or something. If I hire someone and then like I feel like the management process would be like taking, I don't know, like $1 million, seriously. Because it was so like wildly executed. I think like having the idea is one thing, but like actually, I mean, I try to create like just like these like short clips of the episode. Like, I mean, I did like for our shorts, like I did some of them performing well are like we have to like really sit down and like plan out for a whole day for like a 15-second of like a tiny clip in front
Yeah,
of something. It's insane. I feel like the level of like his team would be able to actually execute on top of like the idea, it's like really, really crazy. So I feel like shout out to the team. Although I
appreciate
like,
it.
yeah. Okay, we're at the like almost the end of the interview. I want to like give like one real question and then 1 minute fire on for you. Okay, so in 10 years, like where do you see like listener.com and like yourself?
Wow, it's a big question. I Even before I answer that, I think
Oh, by the way, we're gonna play back in 10 years. So think about your answer
love it.
before you answer it.
Here. I mean, this is probably something people have heard before, but I think it's people overestimate what they can do in a year and underestimate what they can do in 10. And even from the time frame of my career in life, right? I'm 23. I started my show 6.5 years ago.
You're 23. You're only 23. Oh my god. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
So
Okay, keep going.
no,
Sorry.
no. So from like a contextual point, right? Like I started the show almost 7 years ago, and I look back and say like how much it's grown over the years and opportunities. Um, when I think about the future, I think there's like buckets of life that I focus on as an individual, right? Where um, obviously there's like myself and my health, which allows the other three to take place.
Mhm.
Health and personal like endeavors, which we'll dive into. Relationship with a partner, I'm engaged, and that's obviously an extreme
Congrats again.
point. Thank you. There's business, and then like family in a sense. But I like this. I was going on a run with a friend of mine, and I always like stories. I can always kind of, I love answering through stories. I was going on a run with a friend of mine, probably like a month ago, and I'm talking about the next 6 years of my life from the running perspective. Of the last 2 years, I've done 2 marathons. First one in Hawaii, the second one last year in Palm Beach, and this year, 2024, I'm running the New York City Marathon in November, and that's going to start my 6 year journey of doing all 6 of the major marathons, which is New York City, Boston, Chicago, Tokyo, Berlin, and London. And I feel that no matter what you do, And to your question of like, where do I see myself in, 6, 10 years? I commit to things for the long haul, even with my show, right? I've had my podcast when I was 17 or 16, 17 years old. And I've always told myself, like, I am always going to do this. Like, I am committed to it. Obviously, that translates to business as well. Like, I didn't go to college. I graduated high school and moved across the country when I was 18, committed to it. So when I think about the next 10 years, it's like now being in a place where you have a committed partner, you are like very focused on your health and well-being and longevity. And obviously running is like this great goal marker of like, I want to do all 6 of the major marathons by the time I'm 30. And it gives you things to work towards and work on. And I think that same goes with your business, right? With listener.com and how I see podcasting as I've committed to the medium. Obviously, in a world where things are changing faster than ever before, I believe that nobody can truly predict where they or what the world will look like in 10 years, of course, or we would all be geniuses. So for me, it's just about being the most adaptable with current technologies, with current just things happening in the world from the personal perspective, from the business perspective, and just really having that deep commitment into what I'm doing, right? Like there's an abundance of things that we can all spend our time and energy on. And I believe that your focus and commitment to something is at the foundation what's most important to that 10-year vision. And to be adaptable, to take feedback, to always try to learn something every day. And, I don't want to sit here and try to say like, here's exactly what I will be doing, but I know in 10 years, I'll still be hosting my show. I'll still be running listener unless something happens in the, from an acquisition perspective. But this is a venture that I know that I'm so deeply committed to. My partner, and of course, like getting better every day is just as a human, someone that wants to learn every day, someone wants to get better in the gym every day. And again, I'm not saying that as like I'm not perfect, and there's hard days are challenging and it's not easy. But yeah, when I think about the future, I want to be better, and I think having that growth minded mentality on life is extremely important.
Uh, that's such a beautiful answer. And then, okay, so we have a 1 minute fire round. I want to make sure that like I don't waste too much of your time. So, what's your favorite book?
Favorite book, one of it popped in my mind, the Richard Branson, his biography is one of my favorites. That just
I think he have multiple book. I think I listened to the biography ones, and I think he have multiple book.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
the
like
first one's called Losing My Virginity. The second one's called Finding My Virginity. The,
yeah.
the sequel.
Yeah. It was crazy that like I feel like I remember the detail was like his mom would like put them in like the wild forest or something and then ask him to like come back home. I was like, wow, that's like crazy. But anyway, so and then
Yeah,
he talked about like how his like virgin record when he started the business and like his school and stuff like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I feel like that's a really
that's
great.
a great. I would say that's like top of mind right now is just like a biography that I've loved recently. Like there's so
Yeah.
many classics that I could reference of, How to Win Friends and Influence People if you can grow
Mhm.
rich. But I love biographies. I love storytelling, and those are books that I tend to remember a lot
Yeah,
and I
for
relate
sure.
to it. So yeah,
Shoe Dog is another one. Shout out to Shoe Dog, like the
yeah.
19 one. Yeah, that's a good book. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Um, I like to say Steve Jobs.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
I'll have two answers. One is my incredible partner, Jacqueline Burnett, and just by having someone that's always looking to help, always looking to like be there for you and elevate you. We started dating 4 years ago. As like in the last 4 years, so much has changed and happened and growth. So I mean, that's obviously a lot attributed to just having someone that's there for you in your corner. And then from the like mentor perspective, I got to give a shout out to my guy Aristotle Loomis. He's someone that I had on my podcast years ago, who I met through Stephen Galanis, the founder of Cameo, and Aristotle has just been instrumental in my growth as an entrepreneur, as someone that's like from a deal maker, invest, like trying to like raising capital. Like he's just someone that when I think about what mentorship means, it's what he does and how he shows up in my life. So got to give a shout out to him.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Training for marathons about to be. I'm like 20 weeks out from the marathon, so a lot of running is about to take
Oh my.
place, and that's obviously a lot of commitment from the hours. So you can find me running around LA, training for marathons.
Amazing. Well, Casey, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was such a fun chat.
Of course, thank you, Grace.
Let me quickly end stream.